The Junkers Ju87 Stuka was a German dive bomber and ground attack aircraft that first saw service during the Spanish Civil War in 1937, but it would go on to gain infamy during the earlier stages of World War II for its participation in blitzkrieg tactics to aid the rapid advance of the German forces. Early versions were fitted with sirens, which would instill fear among those on the ground as it began its diving attacks. Despite this infamy though, the aircraft was considered obsolete pretty quickly due to its slow speed, and it became easy prey for enemy fighters. Although removed from certain battlefronts to prevent high losses, the airframe of the Ju87 did have various upgrades to ensure that there was always a role for it to play. One of these was the installation of 37mm cannons in the later years of the war for use in anti-tank operations. Join me in this video as I build the Ju87G Tankbuster kit in 1/72nd scale from Revell. For a more detailed look inside the box of this kit, I completed an unboxing review of this model, and that video can be found on my channel. For this video, however, I will focus on the quality of the build and what it looks like at the end. As always, before I get started, please remember that adult supervision may be required when building model kits due to the use of sharp tools and toxic paints and chemicals. Revell recommends this kit to those aged 10 years and older. So, without any further ado, let's get into it. The first step was to give the plastic parts a wash in warm soapy water. This will help remove any oil or grease left over from the moulding process and give a good clean surface for paints and cement to stick to. With that done, I left these parts to air dry. Whilst they were drying, I went through the instructions and annotated all the paints I was going to use. I find the method Revell uses to be less than ideal, so I will make my own notes to make it easier. Now it's time to start building. Throughout this one, I'll be either snipping the parts from the sprue with a set of cutters or slicing them off with a sharp knife. Excess plastic and flash can then be cut away or sanded off with a file. Here, I'm starting by removing and cleaning up the parts for the cockpit interior. I'm using Revell contactor cement as it can be accurately placed with the applicator needle. The cockpit floor has a number of parts which need to be cemented to it. These include the control column, pilot and gunner's seats, and a bulkhead. This is the moulded engine component. As you can see, there was quite a lot of excess flash on this that had to be removed before I could add it to the build. The engine comes in two parts which need cementing together. A central pin can be placed inside, which will later form the mounting point for the propeller. If you are careful and don't cement this particular part in place, the propeller will be free to rotate. Humbrol 246 RLM 75 Grey Violet matte acrylic paint was thinned with Tamiya acrylic thinner X20A at a rough ratio of 2 parts paint to 1 part thinner. This will help it flow better and avoid leaving brush strokes when it dries. A few layers might be required to get even coverage though. I painted this onto the entire cockpit and engine assembly using a medium brush for quick coverage. With that now dry, Humbrol 103 cream matte acrylic was carefully painted onto the moulded representation of the seatbelts. The control column was painted with Humbrol 33 matte black, whilst the buckles on the seatbelts were given a coat of 11 silver. Humbrol 53 gunmetal grey was used to paint the entire engine component, the grey undercoat helping to bind it onto the model and prevent it from pooling in places, as sometimes can happen when you paint this particular colour onto the plastic directly. I again thinned this paint before application. Humbrol 159 khaki drab was used for the internal areas of the engine bay, including the mounting pylons. I thinned this paint in the pot as it was on its last legs, and there wasn't a great deal of this left. When the paint had dried, the engine was attached to the mounting pylons using the moulded locating pins to get it lined up correctly. I then gave this assembly a coat of Citadel non-oil acrylic wash to bring out some of the details and give the impression of dirt and grime. To install the various engine parts inside the fuselage, first a bulkhead has to be glued towards the front of the cockpit area. This is then followed by cementing the radiator component in the nose air intake slot. The engine assembly can now be glued to the mounting points inside the fuselage, taking care to make sure it's level and that the propeller mounting pin protrudes through the nose of the plane. The control panel is then glued inside the cockpit, with the cockpit seat assembly being added shortly afterwards. A little care might be needed to make sure it all lines up correctly. The decal for the control panel was carefully cut away from the rest of the sheet. Not entirely sure why Revell decided to put the first decal you will need in the middle of this sheet though. It would have made more sense to put it on the edge to make it easier to remove, but alas, with some care, it was done. I soaked the decal in warm water so that it would release from the backing paper, and whilst it was doing this, I gave the control panel a coat of Humbrol decal fix. The transfer was then slid into place and a further coat of decal fix applied on top. The decal fix will help soften the transfer into the surface of the plastic part and give a good bond. The two fuselage halves can now be cemented together, taking care with my application of the cement. The alignment is generally okay, but those perfectionists among you might want to do a little work to clean up the joins. As I'm building the G version of the Stuka, the machine guns moulded onto the wings have to be removed, as that variant of the aircraft did not have them. If you decide to build the D version, you won't need to do this. I carefully cut them away using a sharp knife and then sanded the area smooth. The lower wing parts have a number of moulded indicator marks for various holes that can be opened up. You must pay attention to the instructions so that you open up the correct holes for the aircraft that you are building. For example, as I'm building the G version with the large underwing guns, these holes were drilled out using a fine drill bit so that they could be installed. The other holes were not touched however, as these would be for the bombs and air brakes of the D version. Now it's time to join the wings to the fuselage. First, the upper wing parts are slotted into their holes in the fuselage and cemented into place. Then the lower wings are joined to the top parts. The wing tips can then be cemented into their slots in the ends of the wings. I'm not a fan of this particular design choice from Revell, as it does leave join marks. The horizontal stabilizers on the tail can now be added to the assembly. They also cement into slots with a bracing strut added underneath. Here I'm cementing on the two air intakes under the wings, which I drilled the holes for earlier. Some smaller detailing parts can be glued to the two slots in the fuselage here. I need to take care as I handle the model, as these are very easy to knock off. Now it's time to assemble the 37mm cannons. These come in a number of parts, with the cannons coming in two halves that need to be joined together. The ammunition magazine is then pushed through the slot in the guns and also cemented into place. With that done, they can then be added to the model using the holes I previously drilled in the lower wings. You will need to ensure that they dry level though, as they have a tendency to droop to one side or the other as the glue cures. The main landing gear wheels come in two halves, which can simply be joined together. I gave them a coat of Humbrol 33 matte black before the next step. Each landing gear leg also comes in two halves, and they simply sandwich the wheels. It is the intention of the design that these wheels be free to rotate if you are careful with the glue. This does add an element of play value, but I'm not too fussed about that. The landing gear can now be added to the lower side of the aircraft. Revell have used a different slot on each leg so that you can only install them the correct way round. The pitot tube can now be added into the leading edge of the wing. Again, this fits into a little hole, but it does need to be held in place until the cement dries to stop it from being at the wrong angle. With the majority of the assembly complete, it's time to start some painting. I thought I'd try out some pre-shading on this one just to see how it would turn out, particularly due to the fact that most of the panel lines on this model are raised rather than recessed. To do this, I applied Humbrol 33 matte black acrylic along all the various panel lines and details using a fine brush. Humbrol 247 RLM 76 light blue matte was then applied to the lower surfaces of the model. I prefer to start with the lightest paint of the camouflage and then work to the darkest. This paint was again thinned with Tamiya acrylic thinners to help improve the flow and avoid leaving brush strokes in the paint as it dried. A number of layers would be needed. In hindsight though, I found this to be a little fiddly to do. The guns and landing gear got in the way a little and made it a bit of a challenge to get the paint in all the right places. Perhaps it would have been better to paint these separately and then add them later. With the lower surfaces done, I turned my attention to the top of the model. Humbrol 242 RLM 71 dark green matte acrylic was thinned as before and then carefully applied. The lower wingtips needed to be painted yellow, so to do this I masked the areas with tape, then used a few coats of thinned down Humbrol 24 matte trainer yellow. Whilst that was drying, I turned my attention to the spinner on the propeller. I painted this with Humbrol 130 satin white, again thinned with the Tamiya acrylic thinners. The masking tape on the wings can now be removed, and there are a few little areas that need tidying up, but generally I have a nice straight line between the two colours. Humbrol 53 gunmetal grey was used to paint the barrels on the cannons. I used 241 RLM 70 black green matte acrylic for the blades of the propeller now that the white spinner has dried. Now I'm turning my attention to the canopy. The moulded frame lines on this clear part are not great, but I took great care painting these with the same colour as the upper camouflage on the aircraft. Using acrylic means that I can tidy up these lines when the paint has dried by using a pointed tool, such as a cocktail stick, to make them look better. This was a fiddly step and I didn't really enjoy doing this part. With the majority of painting now completed, it's time to protect the model and prepare the surfaces for the decals. I used plastic coat satin varnish to do this. I sprayed in a side-to-side motion to ensure even coverage. Please remember to use the correct protective equipment and environment when doing this kind of activity. The satin varnish will provide a smooth surface for the decals and help prevent them from silvering when applied, which a matte surface can cause. The decals were applied in the same way as the one I did for the cockpit control panel. They were cut into more manageable sections, soaked in warm water, and allowed to release from the backing paper. Decal fix was brushed onto the model in the correct locations and the decals then placed on top. When they had cured slightly, more decal fix was brushed over the top, helping to soften the transfers into the surface of the model and make them appear painted on. The decals are generally well printed and applied to the model nicely. The only one I had any difficulty with was the spiral on the propeller spinner, which took some patience to get right. With the decals in place, I mixed Humbrol 53 gunmetal grey and 171 antique bronze in about equal parts. I used this rusty metallic paint on the exhaust on the nose of the model. I carefully painted the tail wheel using 33 matte black. To give a more uniform matte finish, I'm using this cheap matte spray varnish. I will apply thin layers to help prevent it from reacting with the previous layers of paint, which I've experienced in the past. Fortunately, it all worked okay for me this time. I made my own black matte wash by mixing Humbrol 33 matte black with water to get a very thin paint. This was then applied to the entire model to help bring out the details. Excess wash was then removed by a cotton bud soaked in acrylic thinners. Had I not protected the paint with the previous layers of varnish, I would run the risk of removing all the previous acrylic layers at this stage. Next, Humbrol 11 Silver was dry brushed over the model. To dry brush, the paint is removed from the paintbrush onto a paper towel, then the residue applied to the details. The raised areas will collect the paint, leaving the rest of the model untouched. This helps to give an interesting contrast and a slightly chipped effect. The rear-facing machine gun, which has already been painted with 53 gunmetal grey, was now glued in the hole in the back of the cockpit canopy using this clear general-purpose glue. The canopy can then be glued into place using the same product. I did have to take care when using this glue, as it can leave strings that might need to be cleaned up. A small amount of cement was added to the propeller mount, and then the propeller was added to the model. To make the aerial wire, I heated up some excess sprue over a flame, and then, as it started to melt, I drew the two ends away from each other to create a thin wire. I left it to cool, then cut it to the correct length. I sanded a small amount of paint away from the mounting locations on the top of the model, then carefully cemented it into place. I used Humbrol poly cement to do this, as it's a little thicker and will help hold the wire in place as it cures. The excess wire can now be cut away. As the plastic is green, I thought a quick coat of Humbrol 32 dark grey would help hide this and make it look thinner and less noticeable. And for the build of the Ju87G, it's pretty much done. But I feel like I need something to display it on. I had these Airfix 1/76 scale figures in my stash, and I thought that this kit would make a great diorama subject, particularly with its visible engine. I identified the figures I wanted to use and removed them from the sprue. They were then given a wash in warm soapy water. Humbrol Enamel 123 Extra Dark Sea Grey Satin Paint was applied to all the figures as a base layer, apart from one. This one was given a coat of 26 matte khaki acrylic to represent his coat. I then proceeded to paint the figures with the colours as indicated on screen. I used fine brushes to get all the small details correctly picked out. As a side note, I'm pretty much painting these as to how I think they should look. I did a little research into the uniforms of the period, and these were the choices I made based on that information. With them now painted, I protected the paint using the same matte varnish spray as I used on the aircraft. I then applied the same homemade matte black wash that I used previously. Again, the excess was removed using a cotton bud dipped in acrylic thinners. I dry brushed Humbrol 64 light grey acrylic over the figures to give more contrast and highlight the raised details. The figures are now pretty much complete, so the bases were carefully cut away with a sharp knife so that I can use them on my diorama. Speaking of the diorama base, let's get started with that. I cut a circle of card and then painted it with Humbrol 29 Dark Earth to represent mud. When it was dry, I coated the entire base in PVA glue. I then applied Hornby static grass with a static shaker bottle to the base. Any excess can be tapped off and collected for future use. I've got some of this ground up red foam which is going to be used to represent flowers. I'm pushing them into random places and in different sized clumps before the PVA glue on the base dries. With the PVA glue now dry, the aircraft can be placed into position. I then glued the figures onto the base using the general purpose clear glue. A ladder from the spares box was also placed into position, leaning up against the nose of the aircraft to provide access to the engine. My Revell Ju87G Stuka diorama is now complete. So, what did I think of this kit? Well, it's not great. If you're new to the hobby and looking for something to give you a bit of practice, then this would be perfect. But for a serious bit of modelling, I would consider getting a different kit. Generally, the build of the model goes okay. It doesn't really present many challenges in that regard. It is let down though by the amount of flash that has to be removed from the parts and the poor fit, with various seam lines and gaps around the model. The raised details don't really match the quality of more recent kits either, with some of the parts being noticeably chunky and out of scale. The canopy frames are pretty bad too, and I did notice that in places there were some little moulding marks on the plastic which looked like the tooling had been scratched. A lack of pilot or gunner figure is disappointing as well, so if you wanted to add them, you'd have to source some for yourself. I did find the instructions a little hard to follow in places, and the fact that they are printed in black and white means that when it comes to paint the model, it makes it difficult to correctly identify the right colours as they are all grey. Not everything is the fault of the model though, and I have experienced a little silvering of the decals in a few places as I only applied a thin layer of satin varnish. A thicker layer or a gloss coat would have remedied that. Also, a few parts aren't quite fitted correctly. I knocked the pitot tube for example, and now it's at a slightly odd angle. Finally, my homemade wash was quite thick on the underside of the aircraft and has made that look heavily weathered, which was not really the effect I was going for, but I can live with it. On the positive side though, the decals are good and apply to the model well, and I really like that you have the option of displaying the engine inside the aircraft, which I think opens up the opportunities for dioramas like this. Also, retailing at around £10 here in the UK at the time this video was made, that makes it not exactly an expensive kit for someone to mess about with. But, and it's a big but, for only a couple of pounds more you could pick up the Airfix Ju87, which looks to be considerably better quality. Granted, that version is not a G or D, but if you weren't too fussed about the version and really wanted a Stuka, that is probably the one I'd go for. The tooling for this kit dates back to 1975, which makes sense when you consider the lack of detail and amount of flash. The particular version I have here though was released in 2010 with the current paint schemes. The version I've gone for here is a Ju87G-2 used on the Eastern Front in July 1944, but if you'd prefer to build the D3 version, it features a two-tone splinter camo and also depicts an aircraft from 1944. This is turning into a bit of a long one, so let's wrap it up here. The kit is not fantastic and does have a lot of issues, but with some care and patience you will get a reasonable representation of the Junkers Ju87 Stuka. Personally, I found some parts of this build to be enjoyable, and other areas I didn't like so much. This kit has been a bit of a Marmite build. You'll either love it or hate it. If you enjoyed this video or found it useful, please consider pressing that like button, and also feel free to leave a comment with a suggestion for more model builds you might like to see. Make sure you subscribe with notifications on so that you never miss a modelling video too. As always, honourable mention and massive thanks to my patrons over on Patreon. To find out how you can help support the channel and join these people here, take a look at the links in the description. Speaking of the description box, you'll also find links to my social media accounts. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook and Discord. Finally, a massive thank you to you for watching this video, and I'll see you all on the workbench again next time.